Here's what we've been doing this week on the Newscast podcast on BBC. Whoa. It's Pudsey Bear from Children in Need. Hello, Pudsey. Have a seat. Come and analyse this week's news if you want. What's this? Is that an envelope you've got that says Pudsey challenges you? Also, you're trashing the place. Your challenge is to stop trashing the studio. Right. What does it say in here? For BBC Children in Need, challenge yourself to 25. Your challenge is to record a 25-hour episode of Newscasts. Do you know what? I think I could probably do that. Challenge accepted. Thank you, Pudsey. Hello, it's Adam in the Newscast studio. And just to say, we are recording this episode of the podcast at 7:30 on Thursday evening.
And it's Chris in the studio.
And it's Alex in the studio.
And it's also Joe Pike in the studio.
Chris, a few moments ago, we had a proper celebrity sat in that chair.
Did you?
Pudsey Bear from Children
Did
in
you?
Need.
Wow.
Yeah.
That is a celebrity.
Yeah, and he handed me an envelope with a challenge in it, which we're all now part of.
Oh,
yes, sorry to break this news to you.
Okay.
Well, having heard about, Sarah Cox's challenge of having to cycle halfway across the UK.
And everything's around the number 25.
Right,
this year.
yeah. I'm just thinking, what on earth have we been signed up to?
It's a test of endurance built around the number 25, but it is something that we'll be better at than, say, running a lot or drumming a lot or dancing a lot.
Go on.
We're doing a 25-hour-long episode of Newscast.
What?
Oh, wow.
What?
Right.
Which will be live streamed on BBC Sounds and iPlayer on Thursday, the 13th of November, starting at 8 a.m. and finishing at 9 a.m. the next day.
And are you
I don't know
going-
why I'm laughing.
You're going all the way through?
All the way through, apart from loo breaks,
That's
which
really
will not be
impressive.
live streamed.
Oh,
unless
so
it's
you
an
are
event.
doing loo breaks. It's not like senators.
How else
and
would I do it?
I don't
American-
think
it's
you
not
can do
like
25 hours without one.
Well, Cory Booker, 25 hours in the US Senate in
Yeah.
April this year, standing up, no food, no loo breaks.
Well, there's your
I
challenge.
think
Adam.
meant something when it
Okay,
was
well,
on
I'll
the loo,
start
right.
training my bladder. Anyway, last time we saw each other, amazingly, was just before you went to India with Keir Starmer. How did
Yeah.
that trip go?
Yeah, it was really interesting. I think the takeaway, because it was one of those really quick flying, literally visits to Mumbai, which was about effectively celebrating the trade deal they'd signed. But the notable thing from a sort of political watcher's perspective was how much there was like real welcoming for Keir Starmer there. Like there were these massive cutouts, like life-size Keir Starmers everywhere in Mumbai.
Right.
Like you drive down the road, there are 5,700 posters of Keir Starmer and Narendra Modi put up around Mumbai just for this visit. It was like a huge welcome. And it was like the contrast between the Prime Minister on the foreign stage, where he increasingly looks pretty comfortable and people say he's doing pretty well, and then like that kind of domestic return where he's facing a lot of
Back
problems.
to earth.
And you
Back
know
to
what?
earth.
I must admit, that weekend after you got back, I turned on Any Questions. I mean, it's very close to my heart, but I turned on to just work out if, like, halfway through, I was going to hear the sound of Alex's head hitting the desk. Because what you
Another endurance test.
It was.
What, 5 in the morning,
That's
whatever,
right.
and then
Flew
went to
back
York,
overnight,
and then
5 a.m.
and then let's
landing.
talk about domestic politics, which
Yeah.
you've not been doing much of for the previous umpteen days
That's
because you've
it.
been in India.
That's it, yeah.
Well, then, a very neat segue. Joe, for about the last 172 hours, you've been tallying up politicians calling for action on Prince Andrew.
Yes.
Where would you say the tally has got to? And you don't need to give me a precise number. Just
I think we're probably at a stage where there needs to be some sort of action. Certainly, various politicians from different parties are calling for the legal removal of titles, for select committees to bring Prince Andrew before them, for him to disappear from public life altogether, which is what Robert Jenrick suggested earlier this week. But the fact that there is this sort of increasing volume and increasing boldness in political interventions on the royalty is pretty unprecedented. And I'm sure those in the palace are trying to work out how you
So
sort of beat
there's
that.
just like there's
End it.
they're just tipping skip loads of opprobrium. That's probably the best way of describing it, over his head, aren't they? Really, that kind of real sense of open public anger that this has gone on for too long and is unsustainable.
And the Royal Lodge element of it, I think, unlike other parts of this story, is so easy for everyone to understand. He's somebody who is not good enough to be part of sort of royal life. He's been sidelined, he's being punished, and yet he can live in this beautiful 30.
Although he would say
mansion.
he's got a legal contract with the Crown Estate that they negotiated in 2003, and that he paid loads of money to refurbish that building in lieu of rent.
Absolutely,
So he would argue he's
and
got
it's
a
not
good
very
case
easy to get him out of it. And of course, he's denied wrongdoing, and he's never been charged or convicted of anything at all. And yet, it's such a visual, easy to understand.
Because you hear the word lodge, and you half think of some sort of wooden hut somewhere in a forest.
Hansel and Gretel.
And then you see those sort of helicopter shots of what is a sort of mansion.
30 rooms, not 30 bedrooms.
30
so
rooms.
I sound like I'm Prince Andrew's spokesman saying it's only 30 rooms. It's not 30 bedrooms.
Only 30 rooms.
But isn't the bigger problem that this whole issue about Royal Lodge and about titles has suddenly made everybody far more interested in the detail here, including the detail of royal finances.
Yeah.
There's one thing we've known over decades the palace does not like is people looking into that detail. And now we've got select committees looking at some of the details around a royal
Like
lodge.
the very financial architecture that sustains the whole edifice is now a topic of public conversation because of Prince Andrew.
But what it's also done is shone a light on the relationship between Parliament, government, and the royals. Because, there has been, and even there was a bit of misunderstanding kicking around the Houses of Commons this week about whether MPs and what they could raise about the royals in the Commons,
Because there isn't a blanket ban talking
No,
about
but that a lot of people seem to think that there was, that they couldn't criticise the royals in the Commons, and then there had to be this kind of like clarification from the Speaker saying, no, actually, you can. It's just that you can't basically chuck it into the mix whenever you fancy. There's got to be some sort of proper process around it, but you absolutely can. But, I think there are sort of really legitimate questions to ask about how much oversight, how much involvement the government and Parliament should have when it comes to the royals, particularly when there's public money involved, which of course there is when it comes to the Crown.
What people would really like to know is how Prince Andrew finances his life now and who provides that money, whether it's himself, his family, associates, business contacts. But here's the conundrum. He stepped away from public duties several years ago, so actually could probably argue no one has a right to know about that because actually that's nothing to do with public money. He's just a person that people are interested in.
And this was the third intervention of the royal family on Prince Andrew. So after Newsnight interview 2019, you had that initial stage, which was stepping aside from royal duties.
Yeah, which at the time, I remember, it felt like the nuclear option. Like, wow, this is like unprecedented in modern times. But it turns out
he didn't vanish.
Yeah.
Entirely.
And step two was 2022. So that was around that civil case in America involving Virginia Giuffre. That's when the royal patronages and military titles came into it. Last Friday was step three, which is around, of course, the publication of Virginia Giuffre's posthumous memoir, but also these emails which look like Prince Andrew has either been confused or lied about his last contacts post-conviction with Jeffrey Epstein, and also the Royal Lodge. And it doesn't look like that step three, and that step three in 6 years was enough, because that step was not using these titles but not actually legally removing any of them. So there are many more steps that the royal family could still go on.
Just an observation about this most recent step that you were mentioning, Joe, which is without knowing specifically the individual motivations around particular sources deciding to talk to journalists or act in a particular way, there's been enough chains of events in recent days to point towards an element of the sort of dam breaking around a sense within wider royal circles that the current position is not sustainable. And, the speed with which the Freedom of Information request that the Times made around the whole business of the lease on Royal Lodge and the peppercorn rent. Now, there can be multiple reasons why something like that might be answered either slowly or quickly. But the speed with which it was answered, without question, was another set of headlines that were difficult for him to deal with. Some of the stuff that the Mail on Sunday was reporting at the weekend around his conversations with his police protection team way back in 2011. Again, that being something that becomes public knowledge right now, as opposed to at any time in the previous 14 years.
Different subject, the National Statutory Inquiry into child grooming gangs. Before we talk about the chaos that's happened this week, Alex, we should probably just go through all the steps that it took to actually get to there being an inquiry at all.
Yeah, and it has been quite a long process, wasn't it? Right at the beginning
decades.
of the year. I mean, yes, absolutely decades. But I think this latest stage, if you want to view it that way, it kind of erupted at the beginning of this year, actually. And it was this sudden resurgence in the demands for a national inquiry to look into this issue, which has seen so many, mostly but not exclusively women, completely failed by the authorities that were meant to protect them and subject to the most horrendous experiences. There was this kind of call. Keir Starmer initially resisted it on the basis that there had been previous inquiries, and he was saying that the focus should be on implementing the recommendations of previous, more wide-ranging inquiries about child sexual abuse and exploitation. Eventually, then he commissioned Louise Casey, who is his kind of go-to troubleshooter for things across Whitehall, to do a sort of short, sharp review of the grooming gangs issue in particular. And then her recommendation was that there should be a public inquiry. So that was announced. And then we are now embroiled in this kind of turmoil around the process of setting up that inquiry.
And part of the setting up process, Chris, was this panel of victims and survivors who were in conversation with the government about A, what this national inquiry should actually cover, and B, who should be the inquirer in chief, who should chair it.
Completely. And what you have from the government's perspective, and indeed all of those involved really, is like a 360-degree headache. So on the subject of the chair, how do you find someone who wants to do it and is seen to be credible by the widest number of people? And there's an acceptance in government that A, finding somebody who wants to do it and will stick the course will not be easy. And then B, whoever you do find will not be universally welcomed. So some ministers were really keen on this guy, Jim Gamble, who used to be, to give you a sense of his biography, he used to be in policing in Northern Ireland during the Troubles and then spent years helping the victims of child exploitation. So two jobs that you couldn't exactly describe as being straightforward. And yet he did not fancy taking on this job and talked publicly about how he felt, how politicised the whole process had become, etc., etc. So now the government is acknowledging it's going to take months for them to find a chair. They're desperate to find someone who...
Oh, so that could be next year.
Yeah. And they're desperate to find someone who will stay the course. Then, separate to that, but it overlaps in terms of the awkwardness, is the views that some of the victims who've been involved in and consulted in the setting up of this process have about Jess Phillips, the safeguarding minister. So some who have gone public and said they only want to be a part of this if she goes, and then others who went public saying they only want to be a part of this if she stays. So another impossible bind. Now, Jess Phillips is not going anywhere. She is supported in the Home Office and in
the safeguarding minister.
Safeguarding minister. She is staying in her post. So I mean, yeah, what a mess. And this is just setting it up, let alone it running its course, it coming to conclusions, and the conclusions being acted upon, which is the whole point.
And also, if you remember what Baroness Casey actually suggested, it wasn't some giant inquiry like the inquiry into infected blood or Bloody Sunday, where you looked at loads of bits of evidence. It was more like an inquiry that could go into particular areas and conduct inquiries that local authorities couldn't do themselves.
And summon witnesses.
It was more like a sort of hit squad, as opposed to a big, giant kind of machine. Let's listen to a bit of Jess Phillips, the safeguarding minister in the House of Commons, and then we'll talk about why this has become quite controversial.
Allegations of intentional delay, lack of interest, or widening of the inquiry's scope and dilution are false.
And Joe, it's those two words, allegation and false, that really riled some of the people that she's supposedly meant to be working with.
Yeah, and one of them has accused Jess Phillips of lying because it seems in the process of consultation around this from a body separate to the government, some survivors have been asked a series of questions, including about a breadth of this inquiry, even though the government are very clear it will be purely focused on grooming gangs. This has been completely chaotic, really. The government have ultimately failed at the first stage. This has all fallen apart. But I do think what they said about the timescale now is what is probably necessary. They need to sort of the pressure valve needs to be used here to say it'll take months to sort of lower expectations, to calm things down, and then once people are feeling calmer, to try and work out if there's a way forward.
I think the the reason that the reaction to what Jess Phillips said there about the false allegations clearly had such resonance, not in a good way, for some of the survivors, was that they were saying that for a long time what they felt was that they hadn't been believed or heard by the authorities. So then to have the perspective that they were putting forward dismissed as a false allegation only exacerbated that view. Because you have to remember, when I say mostly women, of course they were girls, they were children, a lot of them at the time. And then when they did find the courage to speak up or speak out, then they weren't kind of listened to. So it's clearly, and that speaks to why this is just so difficult, because there are those survivors who feel that way very strongly, that Jess Phillips shouldn't be a part. There are those who really do want her to stay. But of course here, these are people that you can totally understand, and I don't want to speak for them, but you can't even imagine some of the experiences they had. And to be able to trust anybody in a position of authority after that experience, that must be quite a fragile thing. Yeah. And I think that is why, for the government, clearly, they're now finding this position.
Although I was quite struck by Jim Gamble's statement, so the guy who pulled out from being the potential chair, and he had quite harsh words for all politicians in all directions for politicising this. Yeah. Of course, that's what politicians do. They make political arguments about issues. But he was saying there was a parallel universe where there was some cross-party consensus that took some of the political heat out of this and did this in a much more constructive way.
Yeah, I think there is that parallel universe, although I'm not sure that was ever realistically.
Well, that's the point of parallel universes.
Well, indeed. The other thing is, there were 30 people, I'm told, on this panel. There's fewer than that now because some have stood down. They are clearly of different views and instincts. They're on different views and instincts about whether speaking out is a good idea, whether it is either right to do that or wrong to do that. There are different views about the scope and breadth of the inquiry, different views about who might be an appropriate person to chair it, and whether their own biography, in other words, if they've worked in a sector that some would regard as deeply tainted by all of this, that should exclude them. But then someone was saying to me today, look, there isn't a clean skin out there. If you're going to find somebody who has the credibility to take this on, they are likely to be from a sector, whether it be the judiciary, the government doesn't want to go down that route, but the Conservatives have made that argument, or social care, or the policing. The likely areas where someone's CV would match up to the challenge of this is also likely to overlap with a sector that is likely to be heavily scrutinised and criticised in this process. And that, how do you find a way through that is a path of least disruption, anger, sense of letdown, when, as you say, at the heart of this, as Alex says, you have people who have been profoundly and repeatedly let down by the state. So of course they will very easily be sceptical about any sense that another arm of the state is somehow not handling this properly.
Right, the one in, one out deal, so by which somebody who crosses the English Channel in a small boat gets returned back to France, and in return the UK takes somebody officially and processes them for asylum here or reunites them with a family member here, has now become the one in, one out, one back again, and eventually out again. Has it?
Yeah. Well, yeah.
Which is not as catchy as the first version.
No, yeah, in one case, that's right.
Yeah.
There was this situation that developed this week where somebody who had been sent back to France under the one in, one out scheme then got on a small boat and returned back to the UK again, which, you've got to be blunt about it. Clearly, the government did point to this scheme as, yes, one of the things that it's doing, because it's consistently said it doesn't believe there's a silver bullet when it comes to tackling this issue. But nonetheless, one of the key things that they thought might make a difference, because they hoped ultimately it would act as a deterrent, i.e. people in Calais would hear that they might be sent back if they'd made that small boat crossing, and therefore they wouldn't make the small boat crossing in the first place. Well, this person decided they were going to do it twice. So that does obviously pose a question for the government about the effectiveness of that scheme as a deterrent. Now, Keir Starmer has been pretty clear in saying, we know who this person is, we're going to make sure that they're sent back very quickly. But I do think, obviously, it's going to lead to questions for the government about how effective this is going to be.
We can hear Keir Starmer saying that in his own words.
In relation to the person who's returned, obviously what we've now got is all of his details in the system. At the moment he's shown up, he's already been detained, and he will now be fast-tracked back to France. So trying to get back here has been completely pointless because he's already in the system. We know who he is, we've got him, and we're going to get him back out of the country very, very quickly.
But I suppose if this person does get sent back, I mean, does that still provide the deterrent effect? Because the net result is still that if you cross the English Channel in a small boat, there's a chance you might get sent back.
Well, I mean,
That's still
firstly,
hold.
there's the if, isn't there?
Yeah.
So what process happens between now and them definitely being back in France? The argument those in government make, they accept this as embarrassing. But the argument they make is that up to a point the process worked in that they had this person's biometrics from their first attempt, and therefore when they made a second attempt, it was immediately flagged that they'd been round the block before around all of this. But I mean, I'm really struck again, not least because also happening this week is this whole business where the numbers crossing in small boats so far this calendar year has now hit the same number as the total calendar year of last year, and it's on trend to be similar to the highest year ever, which was back in 2022 of about 45,000 from memory. Is that the language that the Home Office is still using is the language of opposition politicians. They're saying the numbers are shameful, and they're the ones in government, which again speaks to this whole sequence of things they are trying to do. No one's silver bullet, but they're attempting to line up all of these measures that they hope in time will make a difference, whilst acknowledging that, as someone said to me recently about all of this, we're scaling up, but the problem's scaling up faster than we are, and therefore the numbers are still bleak. And that thought that you could get to a point, even in a couple of years, where maybe some of these ideas that they've got do start making a difference, but if the numbers attempting to cross continues to grow, the number might not slow down, or it might slow down relative to where it would have been, but the graph will still be pointing upwards. In
So
other words,
it could be working but getting worse.
Yeah, exactly. It'll just look like failure still, even if it's being successful up to a point.
I mean, I'm ashamed to admit I hadn't quite clocked when the one in, one out deal was being negotiated and then put in place. It's like, well, of course, France can't lock up asylum seekers because we don't lock up asylum seekers. That's why you get put in a hotel or an HMO or a flat, is because when you're in the asylum system, you are free to move around. You don't get detained. And so, of course, that means people in France are free to go and try again.
But what was the plan? What was the government's intention for these people to do after they got back to, I don't know, Paris airport or wherever?
Well, in theory, you need the French asylum system to work super, super quickly, grant that person asylum in France, or repatriate them back to a third country, but instantly.
But therefore expect them to be able to do something that
we struggle with.
The UK is struggling with.
And also, if just in the sort of personal psychology of it, if you have spent probably a lot of money, time, and put yourself in a really dangerous situation to come, maybe cross half the world to go to northern France to take one last dangerous trip, like, why would going back to France mean that you wouldn't try and do that final section again and go back to square one? It just, there isn't necessarily a huge amount of logic to it. And also, you've got this question which Cammy Badenoch has posed: does the person going back a second time, being deported a second time, does that count as one of the French one in, one out? It's not clear what happens there, but I would say that's part of the sort of broader the system.
I mean, I think that's the key thing, was that effectively this scheme was meant to be a deterrent. It questions whether or not it actually is a deterrent. And a lot of people did say for it to be an effective deterrent, people that really understand what's going on, it will have to scale up quite significantly. And even though the government insisted it was just a pilot scheme in the first instance and that it was going to scale up, I think we still don't know whether they have, actually had an agreement with France that this is going to be a really kind of substantial scheme where loads of people are going to be sent
back. And I suppose in time, the extent to which it is a deterrent will be determined by two factors. One, the number and how much scaling up can happen, and then secondly, the proportion who end up having another go. In other words, for whom it has clearly not been a deterrent.
And the proportion of people who decide, partly maybe because of the deterrent they hear and see with these leaflets in northern France, oh, actually, I'm going to go through the legal route, apply to be part of the other part of the one in, one out scheme, not take the dangerous journey. But of course, that is numbers.
And that's back to scaling up again, because if that number's big, the other number's big, and therefore it's a greater likelihood that that's a viable option.
Just a little sidebar issue, but that clip of Keir Starmer that we played a minute ago was an interview with our colleague Zoe Kleinman, who's the technology editor, where Keir Starmer was talking about ID cards. So they're back on the agenda, having appeared on the agenda, then disappeared. But now they're back. But also it was interesting that he was talking to Zoe, because he obviously wanted to talk about it from like a tech point of view.
Completely. And I wanted to have another go at trying to sell them, I think, because when he did it initially, it was wrapped up in, well, firstly, there was a bit of briefing to try and sort of knock the Andy Burnham leadership story off the top of the news bulletins just before Labour conference.
Would you buy a boat?
Well, the first time...
He's had a few bites of this cherry.
Yeah, the first time he mentioned it out loud was talking to me by I must say, a ship, because I was told off for calling it a boat. So just, I don't want to get you into trouble with our boys and girls in the Navy. Yes, we were on the banks of the Clyde talking, but I spent most of the interview talking about Angela Rayner, because that was the story at the time.
Who's also back. But...
and then he mentioned, I asked him about ID, and then I was like, oh, that's interesting. On any other day, I'd make a whole thing about that, and then we barely covered it because we were all obsessing about Angela Rayner. So that really didn't get much of an outing. And then he had another go 3 weeks later, and then there was Andy Burnham, and then he started dropping it into a speech where he was talking about the future of the left on the global stage and blah, blah, blah. And I think he wanted to have a clean go at talking about what he sees as the merits, knowing that there's been, 3 million people now signing a petition on Parliament's website thinking it's a terrible idea.
Just as an aside, during the trip to India, he actually met the man who was the architect of India's digital ID system, which was introduced and scaled up rapidly
to 1.2 billion people.
Yeah, it's a 12-digit number, which means most people use it to access most public services. I think you can even use it for sort of payments and things. Like, it's become this really extensive thing, but it isn't without controversy at all. Things around data sharing, things around people that might have been excluded from that. And it was interesting that Keir Starmer met him to discuss, and Downing Street was saying, look, it doesn't mean we're going to copy the model, very different parameters in the UK, but still fascinating he met him. And then, interestingly, the kind of shift from Downing Street at that point, where it was, as opposed to initially when this was first announced, it was very much this is to tackle illegal working, and it's a part of our efforts to tackle people coming to the UK, to stop in the league, trying to sell the wider benefits as they would see it about improving access to public services.
Reducing the faff, I think he said today.
Yeah, and I think there's been a really notable shift in the approach from Downing Street on this, where they think that they do need to make a broader argument.
Like a consumer argument, almost,
Yeah.
I've lost track of the Labour deputy leadership contest. Have the ballots closed? Is it?
Yes.
Yes, they have.
Yes.
They have. So
On Thursday closed.
right.
Announcement Saturday.
Yeah, Saturday morning. It's
A big snazzy event?
no,
planned?
no, it's
Oh,
the opposite.
An
I mean,
email.
it's like a
meeting that could have been an email.
It's like a fire
The
blanket
letter.
just being thrown over it in hope of boring everyone to pretending it's not really happening. It's basically.
Do you think if
but,
it was
and for that
different-
reason, I'm covering it because I'm covering it.
That's right. it's Saturday
Yeah,
morning.
no,
Forget
exactly.
park run.
But we're not being invited into a room as reporters to sit there and then watch some returning officer come out and say, I hereby declare. None of that. The camera's going in, and then I think the two candidates will be in the same place. Originally, there was a bit of talk that the whole thing might be like on Zoom. They don't see anything in it for them for making a big deal out of it, because the whole nature of the deputy leadership role, whoever it is, but particularly if it's Lucy Powell, which is widely expected, is to be that kind of sort of, depending on how you decide to do the job, that kind of rain check on the leadership, or that counter to the leadership, or that voice for the members into the leadership. And they don't want to make a fuss about it.
Right. Lovely to see you all.
Pleasure as ever.
And look forward to your thrilling Saturday morning, Chris. We'll be tuning in.
It's going to be great.
You've really sold
I know how to live at the
And
weekend.
if only it was happening in the middle of a 25-hour-long live podcast-a-thon, we could take
helpful.
the result in minute detail down to 57 decimal points. Just to
No,
make
exactly,
it
and that'd just leave you with 24 and a half hours to film.
Exactly. Anyway, that's it for this episode of Newscast. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.